Edward, heir to a vast fortune. He is shown at extravagant parties, surrounded by wealthy friends and flaunting his riches. His arrogance and disdain for the poor become evident when he publicly humiliates a group of homeless people. Edward's father, fed up with his irresponsible and cruel behavior, suddenly disinherits him. The sound of clinking glasses and loud laughter echoed through the grand hall of the mansion. Edward, heir to a vast fortune, stood at the center of it all, a confident smile on his face as he soaked in the praise from the friends surrounding him. The party was a clear display of power and wealth. The glow from the crystal chandeliers illuminated the room with extravagant brightness, reflecting the opulence that dominated every corner of the house. Expensive clothes, fine perfumes, and rare wines set the tone for an atmosphere that, for Edward, was completely normal. That night, the mood felt like an extension of Edward's ego. He moved with the certainty that he was invincible. His family's money not only brought him comfort, it gave him an invisible authority, a sense of superiority he'd nurtured since childhood. His education at the finest schools and immersion in the highest levels of society had created a persona that saw the world as a stage, and himself as the undisputed lead. As the party continued, Edward and his friends decided to leave the mansion and walk around the upscale neighborhood. Laughing loudly and carefree, they barely noticed the people passing by. When they reached one of the busier corners, they saw a small group of homeless people. They were ragged figures sitting on the sidewalks, some holding empty cups, hoping for spare change. To Edward, the sight was an insult. "Look at this," Edward said, laughing. "They shouldn't allow this kind of people around here. They're ruining the view." His disdainful tone caught his friends' attention, and they immediately started laughing and mocking the homeless. But Edward went further. He approached one of them, an elderly man with a scruffy beard and dirty clothes, who looked at him with a mix of weariness and resignation. Without hesitation, Edward tossed some coins onto the ground, making them clatter loudly as he smiled arrogantly. "Here you go. Maybe this will buy you a bath," Edward said, turning to his friends, who laughed at the humiliation. The man said nothing, just lowered his head without picking up the coins. To Edward, it felt like a victory. He was in control, and the world around him seemed shaped for his domination. At that moment, he didn't see the man as a human being. To Edward, the poor were merely a reflection of what he'd never be: weak, miserable, worthless. When they returned to the mansion, the party continued, but Edward's behavior that night hadn't gone unnoticed by a watchful pair of eyes. His father, Robert, a respected businessman. Robert had built the family empire through hard work, but he always believed that wealth should come with responsibility. In Edward, he saw a reflection of his own fears, the moral decay that unchecked wealth could bring. "I need to talk to you tomorrow morning, Edward," Robert said sternly before leaving the party. Still intoxicated by the night, Edward merely waved dismissively, not giving it much thought. To him, his father's lecture would be another frustrated attempt to convince him to act responsibly, something he never took seriously. The next morning, as the sun poured through the mansion's wide windows, Edward found his father in the family office, an austere space decorated with old books and portraits of their ancestors. Robert sat behind his large mahogany desk, his face grim. The atmosphere was different from any conversation they'd had before. "Sit down, Edward," Robert began, wasting no time. "Last night, I saw what you did. I saw how you treated those people." Edward rolled his eyes, already imagining the speech. "Dad, they were just some beggars. I don't get why this is such a big deal." Robert folded his arms and took a deep breath. "It's a big deal because you don't understand what it means to have responsibility with the power you have. I've given you everything, Edward, and in return, I expected you to become a man of integrity, someone who respects others, no matter their social standing. But what I saw last night was despicable." "Despicable?" Edward laughed. "Dad, this is ridiculous. I was just having fun." Robert's expression hardened. There was something more serious in the air, and Edward began to realize that this conversation was different from the others. His father's tone wasn't one of temporary disappointment. It was something final. "It's time you learn what it truly means to live without the protection of money," Robert said firmly. "Starting today, you no longer have access to your fortune. You're disinherited." Edward blinked, stunned. "What? Is this some kind of joke?" "No, Edward. You're going to learn what it's like to survive on your own. You think money makes you invincible, but you'll find that without it, you're no different from anyone else. From now on, you're on your own. Leave this house." Those words hit Edward like a blow. He stood up abruptly. "You can't do this." "I already did," Robert replied coldly. And you won't return here until you understand the value of things. The real value. With no choice, Edward was forced to leave the mansion, shocked and furious. He felt the sting of humiliation as he was cast out from the life of luxury he'd always known. His expensive clothes, his car, his credit cards, those were now just memories of a power he no longer had. Life, which had once seemed easy and predictable, was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The sun was still high when Edward found himself standing on the sidewalk outside the mansion, holding a small backpack with the few things he managed to grab before being thrown out. The heat from the asphalt rose, intensifying the discomfort that was beginning to take hold of him. He looked around, as if hoping his father would change his mind at any moment. But as the minutes passed, the only thing that became clearer was that this was real. Edward spent the afternoon wandering the streets of the upscale neighborhood. He tried calling a few friends, people he'd always partied with and thought would help him without hesitation. The first call was to Brandon, his old party buddy with whom he'd shared countless nights of drinking and laughter. "Brandon, man, you won't believe what happened. My dad, he's gone crazy." Edward started, forcing a carefree tone. "Hey, Ed, what happened?" Brandon responded, sounding distant. "I got kicked out of the house. He disinherited me, can you believe it?" Edward let out a nervous laugh. "But listen, I need a place to stay for a few days until I sort all this out." On the other end of the line, the silence was suffocating. "Ah, man, this is complicated," Brandon said hesitantly. "Things are kinda tight at home right now, you know? My sister's here with her kids, and, well, it's tough, you know? But hey, I'm sure you'll figure it out. Maybe someone else can help you." "Yeah, sure," Edward replied, biting his lip. "Thanks anyway." He hung up the phone, his stomach tightening. The bitter truth was beginning to sink in, but he tried to push it away. It couldn't be that everyone would abandon him so easily. He tried other numbers, Jennifer, Nate, even his old friend Greg. The excuses were always the same. "Now's not a good time. I'm kinda busy. Maybe next week?" With each new rejection, the feeling of isolation grew. Friends who once laughed with him were now turning their backs. As the sun began to set, Edward realized he had nowhere to go. He walked downtown, hoping to find some place to crash, but the harsh reality of the streets started weighing on him. Without money, without friends, and without a place to stay, he found himself walking through areas he'd hardly noticed before. The narrow, dark streets, where the smell of cheap food and sewage mixed in the air, were now his new backdrop. As the hours dragged on, Edward began to notice the figures that filled these corners of the city. Men and women sitting on sidewalks, wrapped in dirty blankets, some quietly talking to each other, others staring into the void. Beggars, people who, until now, had been invisible to him, were now sharing the same space. The same space where, just months earlier, he had tossed coins at a man as if he were tossing scraps to an animal. Exhaustion finally overcame his pride, and he found a corner on a less busy street. Leaning against the wall of an old building, Edward tried to make his backpack into a pillow. The city's distant noise, the occasional shouts, the sound of footsteps and muffled conversations, all of it seemed amplified, as if the world around him was moving too fast while he was trapped in this situation. "This can't be happening," he thought. The reality of his situation still seemed unreal, like it was temporary. It was only a matter of time before something happened. A phone call, maybe his father reconsidering, and he'd be back to his comfortable life. But the night was long, and the dawn brought no solutions. When the sunlight crept into the narrow streets, Edward felt the weight of the misery that now surrounded him. His body ached from sleeping on the ground, and his head throbbed. Hunger began to gnaw at him with an intensity he had rarely experienced. In the days that followed, Edward found himself doing the unthinkable, digging through his jacket pockets for any spare change to buy a cheap coffee or a piece of bread. He wandered the streets aimlessly, trying to avoid people who might recognize him. The shame was consuming him. After failing to get help from his old acquaintances, Edward began to experience something new. Invisibility. No one looked him in the eye. He passed unnoticed, as if he were part of the urban landscape, a nameless, storyless figure blending into the chaos of the city. Over time, Edward realized that surviving on the streets was harder than he could ever have imagined. This wasn't just a temporary experience of discomfort. It was a constant struggle, a battle to maintain dignity, hope, and even mental health. He saw up close the realities he once despised. People sleeping in filthy alleys, fighting over scraps of food, begging for coins to buy something that would help them make it through another day. He saw the despair on their faces, a despair that was starting to reflect in his own. On another night with no direction, he remembered the last time he'd mocked a man sitting on the street. The same kind of man who now was his only company. Edward kept wandering, hoping for a change of luck, a sign that everything would go back to normal. But as his days turned into a repetition of survival, he began to realize that perhaps the life he knew really was over. And what came next would be something he could never have imagined. The sun was high when Edward woke up in the corner of an alley, where he had finally fallen asleep the night before. The unbearable heat and the stench of garbage around him jolted him awake. His mouth was dry. His throat felt as if he'd swallowed sand. He dragged himself out of the alley, trying to avoid the glances of the few people hurriedly walking down the street. Slowly, Edward started noticing the nuances of life on the streets. It wasn't just the physical discomfort, the cold at night, the suffocating heat during the day. It was the constant sense that the world moved on without acknowledging his presence. He was invisible to everyone. There were beggars on every corner, faces marked by hunger and time, people who, like him, had been forgotten by society. Days passed, and Edward continued to wander aimlessly. He was dirty, his beard growing wildly, and his once impeccable clothes were now stained and torn. He was no longer the arrogant heir who strolled the streets in a sharp suit. He was just another nameless figure. As his resources dwindled, Edward began relying on the charity of others, a bitter irony that deeply troubled him. In the first few days, he still tried to maintain a proud posture, refusing to ask for direct help. But eventually, hunger and exhaustion broke him. He found himself sitting on a corner, a plastic cup in front of him, waiting for any coins to fall. Each time someone passed without looking his way, it felt like a blow. He was beginning to understand the disdain he had once felt for the poor. To him, beggars had been a stain on the perfect scenery of his luxurious life. Now, he understood that behind every dirty face and tired gaze, there was a story, a life that had taken an unexpected turn. On one of his worst mornings, after a rainy night that left him soaked and cold, Edward sat in a park, watching the city's bustle. People rushed by, heading to work or running to appointments, while he remained still, like a shadow. Then, he noticed an older man with a gray beard and a calm look sitting a few feet away. The man wore simple, but clean clothes, and he seemed at peace with his situation. He held a piece of bread, and unlike the other homeless people Edward had seen, this man didn't appear desperate. On the contrary, he seemed to be watching the world with a different perspective, almost as if he was above the misery surrounding him. Curious, Edward observed him for a while. The man noticed his gaze and nodded slightly, as if inviting Edward to come closer. With little to lose, Edward stood and walked over to him, sitting beside him. "Are you hungry?" the man asked, extending half of his bread to Edward. Edward hesitated for a moment, his pride still trying to maintain some control, but the hunger was stronger. He accepted the piece of bread, murmuring a barely audible thank you. "My name is John," the man said with a calm smile. "And yours?" "Edward," he replied, chewing the bread slowly. "You look like you've been around here for a while," John commented, looking at Edward with curiosity but without judgment. "Some days," Edward answered, avoiding going into details. "I'm trying to get out of this situation." John nodded slowly. "I know how that is. Life on the streets isn't easy, but believe me, we all have a story. No one ends up here by accident." Edward only nodded. In the past few days, he had learned that the streets had their own code and that it wasn't always safe to talk about his former life. Besides, he still refused to fully accept his new reality. John, however, seemed to see through Edward's silence. He was an experienced man, with many years behind him and a wisdom that came from the hard life he lived. Unlike the others Edward had met, John didn't seem bitter or defeated. "You seem new around here," John continued, as if talking about the weather or some random news. "I think you're still trying to understand how it all works, aren't you?" Edward looked at him, feeling a pang of wounded pride. "I'm not like them," he replied, pointing at a group of beggars huddled on the other side of the park. John smiled wisely. "No one thinks they are, until they realize that, in some way, we're all the same." There was an awkward silence for a few moments. Edward knew John was right, but he wasn't ready to admit it. Even after everything, part of him still wanted to believe that his situation was temporary, that he could return to his old life. "If you need anything, I'll be around," John said, getting up calmly and adjusting his worn-out jacket. "And believe me, sometimes a little help can make all the difference." John took a few steps and disappeared down the street, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts. In the days that followed, Edward continued to roam the streets, but now he saw John frequently. The older man always seemed to be nearby, always watching, but never interfering too much. John's presence, in a way, began to bring Edward some comfort, as if he had finally found someone who understood his situation without judging him. Little by little, Edward began accepting John's help more often. He taught him tricks for surviving on the streets, where to find food, how to avoid trouble, and, most importantly, how to keep his dignity amid the misery. For Edward, these lessons were painful but necessary. Slowly, he was adapting to his new life, though he still resisted fully accepting his condition. The reality of the streets was starting to settle in for Edward, and with it, the slow erosion of his pride. What he didn't know, however, was that his journey of learning was only just beginning, and John had much more to teach him. Days on the streets had begun to blend into a quiet routine for Edward. The initial shock, the sting of being invisible, and the constant battle against hunger and exhaustion slowly became part of his new reality. But something had changed. Since meeting John, the feeling of total loneliness had softened. Though Edward still resisted fully embracing the older man's help, he knew John was watching from a distance, waiting for the right moment to offer advice or comfort. One particularly cold morning, Edward found John sitting on the same bench in the park as always. John sat calmly, as if the biting wind didn't bother him. He held something in his hands, an old coat that, from afar, looked in better shape than the one Edward wore. "Good morning," John said with a smile, extending the coat. "I think this might fit you. It'll help you stay warm." Edward hesitated. Accepting another act of generosity from John stung his pride, but the wind biting through his clothes made him shiver, and he knew he had no choice. Reluctantly, he took the coat. "Thanks," he muttered, barely meeting John's eyes. John just nodded, as if expecting nothing more. To him, offering help was natural, a reflection of the life he had lived. "You know," John began, adjusting his worn-out jacket, "the first thing you lose on the streets isn't money. It's control over your life. The moment you don't know where your next meal is coming from or where you're going to sleep, the sense of power over your destiny disappears." Edward didn't respond right away, but John's words struck a chord. He hadn't felt in control of his life for days, maybe weeks. Everything he did now was about surviving, and it left him in a constant state of alert and despair. It was as if his life had become a series of unpredictable events, and the old security of his wealth seemed like a distant dream. John continued, almost as if he were reflecting out loud. "Many of us ended up here because life threw us off course. Some lost jobs, others family, and some, like me, chose to be here. But in the end, what keeps dignity is understanding that even without control, we're still responsible for how we treat others. That, no one can take from us." John's words echoed in Edward's mind. He remembered how, not too long ago, he believed that controlling his life meant controlling others, despising anyone who wasn't in his position. Now, he was learning a different lesson. There was a kind of strength in maintaining dignity and compassion, even when the world around you seemed to be falling apart. Over time, Edward began talking more with John. Their conversations were simple but filled with a wisdom Edward was slowly starting to appreciate. John taught him small things about street life: where to find shelter when it rained, how to ask for food in the right places, and even how to avoid fights or trouble with other homeless people. "Here, we all have our own territory," John explained one day, pointing to the sidewalks around them. "It's not official, but you notice it. That guy over there, near the newsstand? He won't like it if you stay in his spot for too long. Better find your own corner." Edward was beginning to understand the unspoken rules of life on the streets. Each space, every corner of the city, had its own codes and its own owners. Survival wasn't just physical, but also social. He also realized that there was a kind of invisible community, a network of mutual help among the homeless. John seemed to be a central figure in this community, someone respected by the others, and that intrigued Edward. As the weeks went by, Edward began to accept that his life had changed. The hunger, the cold, and the constant uncertainty became part of his daily routine. But unlike what he'd imagined, these hardships hadn't completely destroyed him. He was still standing, and surprisingly, he had found strength he hadn't known he possessed. Much of that, he knew, was thanks to John. One late afternoon, as the sun slowly set behind the city's skyscrapers, John suggested something unexpected. "Tomorrow, you should come with me," he said, while chewing on a piece of bread he'd gotten from a local bakery. "There's a community center nearby that gives out food and clothes. They also offer a bed sometimes for those who need it." Edward hesitated. The idea of depending on charity organizations bothered him deeply. He remembered how, in the past, he looked down on those places, thinking of them as mere band-aids for people who didn't want to work. Now, reality was different, and he knew he needed any help he could find. "It's not weakness to accept help, Edward," John said, as if reading his thoughts. "Weakness is letting pride stop you from surviving." John's words echoed in Edward's mind that night. What did weakness even mean now? When he had everything, his biggest concern had been not to appear weak in front of others. But here, on the streets, the definitions of strength and weakness had changed. Surviving required a new kind of strength, and he was starting to understand that maybe accepting help was part of that strength. The next morning, Edward met John in the park, as agreed. Together, they walked to the community center. The place was crowded with people, men, women, young and old, everyone waiting for a hot meal or a place to rest. Edward felt out of place, as if he were intruding on a space that wasn't his. But when he entered, he realized no one was judging. They were just people like him, trying to survive. John introduced him to the center's volunteers, and soon Edward was sitting with a simple plate of food in front of him. As he ate, something inside him shifted. This wasn't the end of the line, as he had feared at first. It was, in a way, a new beginning. After dinner, John took him to a quieter corner of the center, where some mattresses were spread out on the floor. It was far from comfortable, but it was a roof over their heads. Edward lay down next to John, listening to the muffled sound of conversations around them. "Thank you for this," Edward murmured, almost unable to believe he was thanking someone for something as simple as a plate of food and a place to sleep. John smiled, stretching out on the makeshift bed. "We all need help sometimes. The important thing is what we do after." John's words echoed in Edward's mind as he drifted off to sleep. For the first time in a long while, Edward felt something different inside. It wasn't exactly hope, but an acceptance of the path he was on. He still had much to learn, but he knew now that he wasn't alone. In the days that followed, Edward tried his best to absorb John's lessons. While life on the streets remained difficult, he was beginning to understand the rules of the game. John was right. The streets were a world of their own, with unspoken codes of conduct, and surviving depended as much on resilience as on learning to accept what he once thought unimaginable. However, a part of Edward still resisted. He couldn't stop thinking about his old world, the one where he was respected, feared, and, above all, untouchable. This part of him clung to the belief that he could return to the life he had known. It was a hope that, even in the midst of his desperation, he couldn't let go of. After many nights spent in shelters and parks, Edward decided to try one last desperate move. He believed that if he could just speak to the right people, those who had been part of his social circle before, he could recover his position, or at least find some support to help him escape the streets. His plan was simple: find his old friends and convince them to help him. After all, many of them owed favors to his family, or at least to his fortune. With this determination, Edward temporarily parted ways with John and set out to try his luck in the upscale neighborhood where he used to be known. He walked to the places he used to frequent: exclusive bars, expensive restaurants, and nightclubs. As he got closer to the area, the contrast between his current appearance and the environment he was entering became more and more obvious. He stopped in front of one of the restaurants he used to frequent, a place that oozed wealth and refinement. Through the window, he could see familiar faces, figures from high society, who used to greet him enthusiastically. A pang of hope shot through him when he recognized a few of his friends from old parties, including Brandon, the same guy who had given him vague excuses when he called for help weeks ago. Taking a deep breath, Edward pushed open the glass door and walked into the restaurant. Immediately, the warmth and the smell of gourmet food enveloped him, and he realized just how desperate he was for a decent meal. But what bothered him the most was the look of disapproval he got from the hostess at the entrance. She glanced him up and down, her expression clearly conveying that she didn't want him there. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone making it clear she didn't believe he belonged. "I'm here to see some friends," Edward replied, trying to maintain the confident posture he used to have. Before she could respond, Brandon and another friend, Nate, walked out of the main dining room, laughing and chatting. When they saw Edward, they stopped abruptly. The look of surprise and then disgust on their faces hit Edward like a punch to the gut. "Edward," Brandon said, his voice filled with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Edward tried to force a smile, but the discomfort in his friends was palpable. "I need to talk," he said, trying to sound casual. "I'm going through a rough patch, but I've got a plan to fix everything. I just need a little help, maybe some money to get started." The silence that followed was deafening. Brandon and Nate exchanged nervous glances, clearly wanting to escape the situation as quickly as possible. Man? Nate began, scratching his head. Things are kinda tight for everyone right now, you know? I'm not sure I can help. Brandon nodded, his head bobbing like a puppet. Yeah, Ed. I think you should try something else. We're busy. Good luck, though. And with that, the two brushed past Edward without another word, leaving him standing at the entrance of the restaurant, feeling the weight of failure and humiliation crush him. The laughter and chatter of the customers continued, indifferent to what had just happened. Edward stepped out of the restaurant, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in his mind like a final blow. The night air hit him, and he realized he was exactly where he'd started, but now with the full understanding that there was no going back. The world he once knew had closed its doors to him. His old friends, the people he thought would always be there, had abandoned him without hesitation. He kept walking through the streets, the sting of humiliation burning in his soul. His steps eventually led him, almost unconsciously, back to the community center where John often stayed. There, the familiar sounds of voices mixed with the smell of simple food filled the air. John was sitting in his usual spot, quietly observing the world around him. When he saw Edward approaching, he didn't ask any questions. He just gave a slight nod, as if he already knew what had happened. I tried to go back, John, Edward said, sitting down next to him, his voice heavy with despair. I tried to talk to my friends, but they treated me like I didn't exist, like I was invisible. John nodded slowly, his expression understanding but firm. That's the hardest part, John said, his voice soft but filled with wisdom. You expected your old world to be waiting for you. But when you fall, you find out that most of the people who surrounded you were only there out of convenience. Now, they see in you what they've always wanted to avoid. Edward sat in silence, feeling the weight of John's words. It was true. He had spent years surrounded by people who only cared about the image he projected, the wealth he flaunted. Now that it was gone, he was no longer useful to them. He was just another person on the streets. And what do I do now? Edward asked, his voice barely above a whisper. John looked at him for a moment before answering. Now, you begin for real. The simplicity of the answer made Edward pause. Begin for real? What did that mean? Surviving isn't easy, but living is harder, John continued. Until now, you were just trying to survive, hoping everything would go back to how it was. But that's not going to happen. The life you knew is over, Edward. Now, you have to decide what you're going to do next. Edward felt a lump in his throat. For the first time, the reality of his situation hit him with full force. There was no possibility of returning. The world he knew was gone, and he was trapped in a new reality where he was just one among many, struggling to survive. With his head down, Edward realized that, for the first time in a long while, he was truly alone. No more illusions about who his friends were or where he belonged in the world. And despite the pain, there was something almost liberating about it. For the first time, he was facing a real choice, whether to live a new life, without the protection of his wealth or status. Are you ready for that? John asked, in a tone that suggested he knew this was a question only Edward could answer. Edward didn't know the answer yet, but he knew that he was starting to see the path he needed to follow. The days following Edward's humiliation in the restaurant were some of the hardest he had ever faced. The sting of being ignored by his old friends had pierced his pride in a way he hadn't thought possible. The shock of realizing that he was, in fact, invisible to the world he once dominated began to wear off, replaced by something deeper. The life he had known, the life of luxury, power, and status, was truly over, and he was starting to accept it. John, as always, was there. He never pushed Edward to talk, giving him space to process his fall. The nights were cold, and the meals were meager, but Edward was starting to understand that there was a strange kind of peace in accepting reality as it was. It wasn't a complete peace, but an inner truce, a sense that he was finally stopping his fight against the inevitable. One morning, after a restless night's sleep, John approached Edward as he sat on a bench outside the community center. Are you ready to work? John asked, breaking the silence with a question that seemed out of place. Edward looked at him with surprise. Work? The word felt strange, almost foreign to him. Work? What kind of work? Edward responded, his voice tinged with disbelief. John smiled slightly. Everyone does something here. It doesn't come with a paycheck, but it keeps your mind busy. And sometimes, when you help others, you end up helping yourself. Edward didn't answer immediately. He didn't know what to expect. To him, Work had always meant boardrooms, big deals, and financial decisions. He had never thought of work as something simple or straightforward. However, the idea of doing something, anything, to keep his mind from spiraling out of control began to appeal to him. "What do you have in mind?" Edward finally asked, resigned. John pointed to an area behind the community center, where several people were unloading trucks filled with donations of food and clothes. "They could use extra hands. And afterward, we can help serve meals. It's not glamorous, but it keeps you moving." Edward felt a pang of discomfort, but at the same time, a strange sense of relief. There was something almost comforting about taking part in such a simple, concrete task, without the pressure of status or judgment. He stood up, followed John to the unloading area, and began helping to carry boxes. The work was exhausting. The food came in large quantities, and the boxes were heavy. Edward wasn't used to physical labor, and soon his body began to ache. But as he worked, he realized that the physical pain was almost a relief, something that kept him focused on the present and distracted him from the constant spiral of thoughts about the past. John worked alongside him, carrying the boxes with the same calm patience he always seemed to have. He never complained, and that intrigued Edward. How could someone who had lived through so much, who had so little, remain so serene? "How do you do it?" Edward asked as they stacked the boxes in the storage area. John glanced at him curiously. "Do what?" "Work like this, live like this, without seeming desperate all the time." John smiled slightly, as if the question was simpler than it appeared. "Desperation doesn't help, Edward. I learned that a long time ago. When you're on the streets, things feel out of control. But there's always one thing you can control, your attitude. And sometimes that's enough to keep you sane." John's words echoed in Edward's mind as he continued working. He was beginning to understand that surviving on the streets wasn't just physical. It was mental and emotional too. Keeping control over your reactions, your state of mind, that was the real challenge. The streets could destroy who you were, but only if you let them. After hours of unloading and organizing donations, John and Edward joined the volunteers serving food to the community. The center was packed, as usual. Entire families came for a hot meal, and Edward saw children running between the tables, smiling, oblivious to the fact that the food they were eating had been donated. There was a bittersweet beauty to the scene, and Edward felt a lump in his throat as he watched. As he served plates of simple food, Edward began to realize something he had never felt in his old life: gratitude from the people he was helping. It wasn't the calculated, self-interested gratitude he had known in the business world, but genuine appreciation. The people smiled and thanked him, not because they expected anything in return, but because they knew that help made a difference for them. This feeling began to stir something inside Edward that he hadn't expected. After a few hours of serving, Edward and John sat down to eat. The meal was simple: rice, beans, and a slice of bread. But at that moment, it tasted better than any banquet Edward had ever had in his days of wealth. He looked around, watching people talk and eat, and he felt something new growing inside him: a sense of belonging. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something, even if it was a community of people with almost nothing. "How do you feel?" John asked, breaking the silence. Edward was quiet for a moment, thinking about his answer. "Tired, but I don't know. In some way, it feels right." John smiled knowingly. That's the secret. Sometimes, doing something simple that helps others gives you a new perspective. Edward reflected on that as he finished his meal. It was true. For the first time since losing everything, he felt useful. Not in the grandiose way he was used to, but in a more honest, straightforward way. It was as if, little by little, he was starting to rebuild something within himself. Something based not on money or power, but on something more human, more real. In the days that followed, Edward continued helping at the community center. He still slept in shelters or on the streets when there was no space, but the work gave him a new structure, a reason to get up each morning. He began to meet others in the same situation, people with stories of downfall similar to his own. Men and women who had lost everything, but who found, through mutual help, a way to keep moving forward. And slowly, Edward began to realize something that had once seemed impossible. He was changing. The anger and resentment he once felt toward his father were fading. The pain of losing everything was still there, but it no longer consumed him. He was learning to live with less, to appreciate small victories, and to recognize that his old life, with all its luxury, had never prepared him to face reality as it truly was. John remained by his side, always quiet, always observant, ready to offer a word of wisdom when needed. He knew that Edward was going through a transformation, and that this transformation was something only Edward could complete. And so, Edward began to see that the path he was on wasn't just about survival. It was about finding a new way to live, a new way to be. And for the first time, he was beginning to accept that maybe, just maybe, he was on the right path. The work at the community center had become part of Edward's routine. Days blurred together, and the weight of his past life, though still present in his memories, no longer dominated his thoughts. Edward felt different. He wasn't the arrogant heir he used to be, and this internal transformation was becoming more and more evident. One day, while he and John were unloading a new batch of donations, something unusual happened. A well-dressed woman stepped out of an elegant car and began handing out clothes and food directly to the homeless. She wore large sunglasses and seemed to want to avoid attracting attention, but her posture caught Edward's eye. There was something strangely familiar about her. Edward watched her for a while, not approaching. Something about the way she distributed the items, almost hurriedly, as if she wanted to be done with it, bothered him. After handing out the last of the bags, the woman returned to her car and drove off without a word. "Do you know her?" Edward asked, feeling a sudden surge of curiosity. John, who had been watching from afar, shook his head. "People like her come by from time to time. They help out of obligation or guilt, not out of true kindness." John's comment made Edward think. He remembered how many times he had made donations or helped others just to maintain appearances or ease his conscience. It was easy to fool yourself into thinking you were doing good when, in reality, it was just an exercise in ego. Now, living on the streets, he saw how rare true charity was. "When I started working here, I thought I was doing myself a favor," Edward said, breaking the silence. "But now, I see that it's more about understanding people than about the act of giving itself. It's not just about what you give, but how you give." John nodded, his usual calm smile on his face. "You're starting to understand." In the days that followed, Edward couldn't shake the image of the well-dressed woman from his mind. He knew there was something more to it, a recognition in her gestures, her presence, that unsettled him. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but the image lingered. Finally, one sunny afternoon, as he and John helped serve lunch at the center, Edward felt it was time to ask the question that had been on his mind for some time. "John, you've never told me much about your life before you ended up here," Edward said, as they ladled rice and beans onto plates. John looked at him, raising an eyebrow as if he had been expecting this question for a while. "I don't think it's that interesting, to be honest." "That's not true," Edward replied, determined. "You know this place inside and out. You have a calmness that no one else has. And you never asked about my life, even when it was clear that I came from a different reality. You know more than you let on." John was silent for a few moments, continuing to serve the people in line. When the last tray had been handed out, he turned to Edward with a different look, more serious than Edward had ever seen him. "Well, I guess it's time for you to know." They left the community center and walked together through the streets until they reached a park not far away. The place was quiet, except for a few birds chirping in the trees. They sat on a wooden bench, and John began to speak, his tone more somber than usual. "A long time ago, I was a partner in a large company. I wasn't an heir like you, but I made my own way. I worked hard, made a fortune, and thought I had everything a man could want." He paused, looking out at the horizon. "But along the way, I lost something important, my essence." Edward stayed quiet, absorbing John's words. "The company I helped build grew, but at the cost of decisions that hurt a lot of people. I distanced myself from the operations when I saw the direction we were heading, but my signature was still on every contract. The weight of that began to consume me. I knew I was hurting people, that families were losing everything because of decisions I had helped make." John sighed deeply, as if the weight of his memories was pressing down on him. "I walked away from it all, left the company, and tried to live a simple life. I thought I could find peace. But guilt, Edward, guilt never goes away completely. You can learn to live with it, but it will always be there, reminding you of what you've done." Edward looked at John, unable to hide his surprise. "And you chose to live on the streets?" John gave a weak smile. "At first, no. I thought I could redeem myself in other ways. But in the end, I realized I needed to be close to the people I had helped hurt. Not out of guilt, but because I needed to understand what really matters. And here, on the streets, Edward, you learn what really matters." Edward was still processing what he had just heard when John made a revelation that would change everything. "I knew your father." John's words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. Edward stared at him, confused. "What do you mean, you knew my father?" John smiled again, but this time with evident sadness. Your father and I were partners. We were friends for many years. He knew about my decision to leave everything behind, and when he saw the direction your life was taking, he came to me. He wanted to understand what I had learned, what made me change. He's the one who asked me to keep an eye on you when he realized you were headed down the same path of arrogance and selfishness. He knew you needed a lesson that he couldn't teach. Edward's mind spun with the flood of information. His father, the one who had disinherited him, had planned all of this? He had asked John to watch over him? The sense of betrayal mixed with confusion. So all of this? Edward began, trying to piece together his thoughts. My father knew I would end up here? He asked you to teach me this lesson? John nodded without breaking eye contact. He didn't want you to follow the same path I did. He wanted you to understand the value of things before it was too late. A rush of anger surged through Edward, hot and violent. So, all this humiliation, all this pain, it was planned? He stood up abruptly, feeling the ground shake beneath his feet. He left me here on purpose? John remained calm, as always, but his expression was more serious now. Edward, your father did it because he believed it was the only way to save you from yourself. He didn't disinherit you out of cruelty. He wanted you to see what really matters. And in a way, he was right. Look at yourself now. Are you the same man you were when you first came to the streets? Edward took a deep breath, fighting back the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. As much as he hated to admit it, John was right. He wasn't the same person, but that didn't make the pain any less real. I need time, Edward murmured before walking away, leaving John alone on the bench. As Edward walked through the streets, his mind raced to process everything. Had his entire life been a lie? Did his father really believe that the only way to save his son was by destroying him? The only thing Edward knew at that moment was that the truth was a sharp blade, and he wasn't ready to deal with the cuts it left. John's revelation had shaken Edward to his core. In the days that followed, he avoided the community center and any contact with John. The weight of the truth was overwhelming. His fall into the streets hadn't been a result of bad luck, but a carefully orchestrated plan by his own father. The anger and pain consumed him. His entire life had been manipulated, and the man he admired most had thrown him into this abyss. As Edward wandered the streets, replaying John's words over and over, he felt as if he were back where he started. All the progress he'd made, the inner changes he'd experienced, suddenly seemed meaningless. He had been deceived. His father, the man who had raised him in a world of wealth and power, had deliberately stripped him of it all. It was too much to bear. After days of introspection and aimless walking, Edward finally returned to the park where he and John often sat. He found himself drawn there, needing answers and clarity. Alone on the familiar bench, he watched the city around him, lost in thought. He was no longer the man he had been, and yet the world felt the same. Only he had changed. That night, as he lay on the cold ground, Edward made a decision. He had to confront his father. The next morning, Edward found John in his usual spot in the park. The older man didn't say much, but his calm presence was enough. John had always seemed to know more than he let on, and Edward realized he needed his guidance once more. I need to go back, Edward said plainly, his voice steady but without hostility. John looked up from his place on the bench and gave Edward a slow nod. You're ready? Yes, Edward said with conviction. I need to understand why he did this. I need to hear it from him. John didn't try to stop him or argue. He knew this moment was inevitable. With John's help, Edward managed to clean himself up and change into something presentable. They found him clothes that didn't scream wealth, but showed he was no longer living on the streets. His mind was clear, focused on the task ahead, to face his father and confront the truth. The journey back to the mansion felt surreal. Every step along the path reminded him of the life he once lived and how distant it had become. When he arrived at the imposing gates of the estate, the security guard recognized him immediately. Edward noticed the flash of surprise in the guard's eyes. It had been months since anyone had seen him. The heir had returned, but he wasn't the same man who had left. The gates opened, and Edward walked up the long driveway, past the perfectly manicured gardens. Everything was as he remembered, immaculate, untouched by time or hardship. Yet to Edward, it all felt foreign. This world no longer belonged to him. The front door swung open before he could reach for the handle, and his father, Robert, stood in the doorway. There was no mistaking the tension on his father's face, but there was something else too, a mix of relief and worry. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Edward was the first to break the silence. I'm here, he said, his voice more controlled than he expected. "I need to know why you did this to me." Robert stepped aside, gesturing for Edward to enter. As Edward crossed the threshold, the familiar scent of the house, the grandeur of the interior, felt strangely cold. They walked together to the office where they had shared so many difficult conversations in the past. Robert sat behind the large mahogany desk, as he always did, but there was a softness in his demeanor this time. "I know you're angry," Robert began, his voice quiet but firm, "and I understand why. But you need to know, Edward, that I did what I did because I love you." Edward stood across from his father, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, still holding onto the anger. "You threw me out," Edward said, his voice low but filled with emotion. "You sent me into the streets, knowing what would happen. You let me suffer." Robert sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Yes, I did. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done. But you were on a path that I knew would destroy you and our family. You were becoming someone who valued nothing but wealth and power, someone who thought the world owed him everything. I didn't want you to end up like others I've seen, lost in their greed and arrogance." Edward's grip on his arms tightened as his father continued. "I saw what you were becoming, Edward. You believed money made you invincible, that you were above everyone else. I had to strip that away from you, so you could learn what really matters. And John, he was the only one who could help you learn that lesson." "John?" Edward asked, the anger rising again. "You planned this with him?" Robert nodded, his expression softening. "John was my friend, my partner, but he also knew the dangers of this life better than anyone. When he walked away from it all, I didn't understand it at first. But as I watched you grow into someone I barely recognized, I knew you needed to learn what he had. I asked him to look out for you, to guide you in a way I couldn't." Edward took a deep breath, trying to process the weight of his father's words. He had been so consumed by his own pain that he hadn't considered his father's perspective. But that didn't make the betrayal feel any less real. "You destroyed everything I had," Edward said, his voice quieter now. "Everything I thought I was." Robert leaned forward, his eyes locking with Edward's. "No, Edward, I didn't destroy you. I gave you the chance to become the man you were always meant to be. And look at you now. You've changed, haven't you?" Edward fell silent, his mind spinning. He had changed. He wasn't the same arrogant, selfish man who had tossed coins at homeless people for amusement. He had learned the value of dignity, of humility, of seeing others as human beings. But that didn't erase the pain of how he had learned those lessons. "I needed to do it, Edward," Robert continued, his voice softer now. "I needed to save you from becoming someone you couldn't come back from. And I needed you to see the world differently, to understand that money isn't everything." Edward exhaled, feeling a strange sense of clarity settling in. He wasn't the same man anymore, and in a twisted way, his father had been right. The man he was before the fall would never have understood what mattered. But that didn't mean the pain would go away overnight. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Edward said honestly, his voice filled with the weight of everything he had been through. "But I understand why you did it." Robert nodded, his expression filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "I don't expect your forgiveness, not now, but I hope that one day, you'll see that it wasn't out of cruelty. It was out of love." Edward stood there, unsure of what to say next. He knew that this was only the beginning of a long journey of healing and understanding between him and his father. But he also knew that he had faced the truth, and he was finally ready to move forward. As Edward left the mansion, the weight of the conversation still hung over him, but there was also a sense of relief. He had confronted his father, learned the truth, and although it didn't erase the pain, it gave him clarity. He knew now that his life was no longer about wealth or power. He had a chance to rebuild, to do something meaningful with the second chance he had been given. He had changed, and now it was time to act on that change. Edward returned to the community center, where John was waiting for him. He was ready to leave the past behind and start something new, something that reflected the lessons he had learned through his fall from grace. There was a fire inside him now, a desire to use his experience to help others. Edward sat down next to John on the familiar bench. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. John looked at him, his calm gaze as understanding as ever. "Ready for what?" "To build something real," Edward replied. "Something that can help the people who need it most. I want to take what I've learned, what you've taught me, and use it to make a difference." John nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "And how do you plan to do that?" Edward thought for a moment. "I want to start a foundation, something that gives real help, housing, jobs, training. Not just handouts, but a way for people to rebuild their lives, just like I've had to. John leaned back, clearly impressed. That's a big commitment, Edward. I know, Edward said, but I'm ready. I've seen what it's like out there. I've lived it, and I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through without a way out. John's smile widened, and he reached out to pat Edward on the back. Then let's get to work. And with that, Edward began to build the John Foundation, an organization that would provide real support to the homeless, helping them find stability and purpose. It wasn't about charity. It was about giving people a second chance, just like the one Edward had been given. Over the months, the foundation grew, offering shelter, job training, and educational programs. Edward threw himself into the work, using the wealth he still had to fund projects that would have a lasting impact. The old Edward, the arrogant heir, was gone, replaced by a man who understood the value of human dignity. As the foundation thrived, Edward and John continued to work side by side. Their bond had grown stronger, not just through the work they did together, but through the lessons they had shared. John had been Edward's guide, and now Edward was using those lessons to guide others. Edward's journey had come full circle. He had lost everything, but in doing so, he had gained something far more valuable, a sense of purpose and a true understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. He had become the man his father always hoped he would be, someone who used his wealth not for power, but for good. And for the first time in his life, Edward felt at peace. He was finally living for something greater than himself. As the John Foundation grew, Edward found himself fully immersed in his new purpose. The organization was thriving, attracting donations and volunteers from people who believed in its mission to provide real, lasting change for those who had been forgotten by society. It wasn't just about giving out meals or offering a bed for a night. It was about giving people the tools to rebuild their lives. Each day, Edward worked alongside John, offering support to those who had ended up where he had once been. The foundation wasn't a charity in the traditional sense. Edward insisted that it focus on empowerment, teaching people how to regain control of their lives by providing education, job training, mental health services, and temporary housing. Months passed, and the foundation's success became undeniable. What had begun as a modest effort to help those in the local community soon expanded. Other cities, inspired by the impact Edward and John had achieved, reached out to partner with them, wanting to replicate the model of hope and recovery in their own regions. But even with all this success, Edward knew he had unfinished business. His relationship with his father, though improved since their conversation, still felt unresolved. He had forgiven Robert to some extent, but the deep emotional wounds of their shared past lingered. His father had always acted out of love, but the pain of how he'd been forced to learn life's hardest lessons had left scars. It was a late afternoon when Edward received a phone call from the family lawyer. The news was sudden and devastating. His father's health had deteriorated rapidly, and he had been admitted to the hospital. Edward dropped everything and rushed to his father's side, feeling a surge of emotions he hadn't expected. As he entered the sterile hospital room, he saw his father lying in bed, looking frail and far older than the last time they had spoken. There was a stillness about him that Edward had never associated with Robert. This was a man who had always been in control, but now he looked vulnerable. Robert opened his eyes and managed a weak smile when he saw his son. "I'm glad you're here," Robert said, his voice soft and raspy. Edward approached the bed, pulling up a chair and sitting beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with all the things left unsaid between them. "You didn't have to come," Robert continued, his voice strained. "I know things between us haven't been easy." Edward took a deep breath, trying to push through the lump in his throat. "I came because I want to be here. We haven't finished everything, Dad. We still have things to say." Robert nodded slowly, as if the effort of speaking was exhausting. "You've changed, Edward. I've been watching what you've done with the foundation. John told me. You're doing something real, something that matters." Edward felt a wave of emotion hit him. His father's approval, something he had always sought in the past, was no longer the driving force behind his actions. But hearing it now, in this moment, meant more than he expected. "I had to change," Edward said softly, "because of what you did. I'm still not sure I've forgiven you, but I understand why you did it. It took time, but I'm finally living for something more than myself." Robert's eyes grew glassy, and his voice trembled as he spoke. "That's all I ever wanted for you, Edward. I know I was hard on you, and I made decisions that hurt you. But I needed you to find your way. I needed you to be the man you were meant to be." Edward felt his own eyes well up with tears, but he blinked them back. "You didn't destroy me, Dad. You made me. I couldn't see it then, but I see it now. I know you did it because you loved me." Robert reached out, his hand trembling, and Edward took it, feeling the fragility in his father's grip. "I'm proud of you," Robert whispered, his voice breaking. "More than you'll ever know." They sat there for a long time, neither needing to say more. In that moment, there was nothing left to prove, no more anger to fight through. Edward had come full circle. He had finally found peace with his father. The next morning, Robert passed away quietly in his sleep. The weight of his death left a void in Edward's heart, but there was also a strange sense of closure. He had made his peace with his father, and he knew that Robert had left the world with a clear conscience. In the weeks following his father's death, Edward found himself more determined than ever to continue the work of the foundation. The loss of Robert only deepened his commitment to creating something lasting, something that would honor both his father's tough love and the wisdom John had imparted on him. One evening, after a long day of meetings and work at the foundation, Edward and John sat on the bench in the park where they had first met. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. Edward felt a sense of calm, but also a growing desire to take the next step. "I've been thinking a lot about the future of the foundation," Edward said, glancing at John, who sat quietly beside him. John smiled faintly, as if he knew what Edward was about to say. "And what are you thinking?" "I want to take what we've built and expand it. I want to reach more people, do more. But most of all, I want to make sure your story is told, John. You've been the heart of this place, and I think it's time the world knows who you are." John shook his head modestly. "I'm just a man, Edward. There's nothing special about me." "There's everything special about you," Edward insisted. "You've lived a life that most people could never understand, and you've helped more people than you realize. The foundation should carry your legacy forward." John looked at Edward, his eyes soft but filled with thought. "Legacy, it's a heavy word, you know, but if you believe my story can help others, then maybe it's worth telling." Edward nodded, knowing that John's humility wouldn't allow him to truly grasp the impact he had made. In the months that followed, Edward set out to document John's life and the lessons he had taught. He worked with writers, journalists, and other volunteers from the foundation to craft a book, The Journey of John, From Fortune to Freedom. The book was more than just a biography. It was a testament to the idea that true wealth doesn't come from money or status, but from living a life with purpose, humility, and compassion. John's story resonated with people from all walks of life. It wasn't just about his fall from grace, but about his rise as a mentor, a guide, and an example of what it means to live authentically. The book's publication brought attention to the foundation on a national scale. Donations poured in, and more cities reached out, asking for guidance on how to replicate the foundation's model. Edward and John traveled across the country, speaking to organizations, community leaders, and even government officials about the importance of creating systems that truly empowered those in need. But through it all, John remained the same, humble, quiet, and always focused on the mission. He had never sought fame or recognition, and even as his story spread, he stayed grounded in his belief that everyone deserved a second chance, just as he had received. Years passed, and the John Foundation became a beacon of hope for countless individuals and families. Edward, now a mature and thoughtful leader, continued to drive the foundation's work, always remembering the lessons he had learned through his own struggles. His father's tough love, combined with John's quiet wisdom, had shaped him into the man he had become, a man dedicated to helping others find their way. One evening, as Edward and John sat in the park once more, watching the sun set over the city, John turned to Edward and smiled. "You've done well, Edward. Your father would be proud." Edward nodded, a deep sense of satisfaction filling his heart. "I wouldn't be here without you, John. You showed me the way." John chuckled softly. "I just pointed you in the right direction. The rest, that was all you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Edward knew that the work they had started would continue long after they were gone. The foundation, the lives they had touched, and the lessons they had shared would live on as their legacy, a testament to the power of transformation, compassion, and the belief that everyone deserves a second chance. And as they sat there in silence, Edward felt at peace, knowing that he had found not only redemption but a purpose far greater than he had ever imagined. I hope you enjoyed this emotional story. If it touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our future stories. Share it with your friends and leave your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your opinions and suggestions so we can continue bringing you stories that move and inspire.